They are the Pagans, and their motto is do unto others, then split.
They started as a small group of riders on the East Coast, men chasing freedom on two wheels, bonded by rebellion. But what began as a club of outsiders quickly grew into something darker. Their name was the Pagans, and within a few short years, they transformed from neighborhood riders into one of the most feared outlaw motorcycle gangs in America. Today, their colors spark fear, their history is drenched in blood, and their reputation rivals even the Hells Angels. This is not just the story of a gang, it is the rise of an empire built on violence, drugs, and domination. The birth of the Pagans. In the 1950s and 1960s, America's highways were exploding with freedom. Cars roared down newly built interstates, rock and roll was on the radio, and young men restless from war or weary of suburbia sought escape on motorcycles. These weren't just bikes, they were symbols of rebellion. On the East Coast, where factory jobs chained men to routine and the grit of industrial cities weighed heavy, motorcycles became a ticket out. And from this need to escape, to carve out an identity that society rejected, came a group of riders who would eventually call themselves the Pagans Motorcycle Club. The origins of the Pagans weren't grand. There was no master plan, no blueprint to become one of the most feared outlaw motorcycle clubs in America. It started small, working-class men in Maryland and surrounding areas gathering on weekends, riding together, drinking together, and escaping the dull repetition of everyday life. In the beginning, the Pagans looked more like a neighborhood motorcycle association than a gang. They had patches, but not the fearsome imagery yet. They had rules, but not the ironclad outlaw code that would later define them. But something was already brewing beneath the surface. Unlike other motorcycle clubs that were content with riding and camaraderie, the Pagans attracted a different kind of man. Harder, meaner, restless. They weren't satisfied with being another social club on two wheels. They wanted to be respected, feared, and recognized as the toughest riders on the East Coast. This hunger for dominance would prove to be the seed of everything that followed. The Pagans grew during a time when outlaw biker culture was exploding across America. On the West Coast, the Hells Angels were already grabbing headlines for their wild parties, violent clashes, and growing criminal connections. In the Midwest, the outlaws were doing the same. For the East Coast, the Pagans would become that symbol of chaos and rebellion. The name itself carried menace. Taken from ancient non-believers who rejected organized religion, the Pagans symbolized rejection of law, order, and society itself. By the late 1960s, the club had its first president, Lou Dobkin. Dobkin wasn't a movie-style biker with wild charisma. He was cold, calculating, and determined to turn the club into something much larger. He recognized that the Pagans weren't just a group of riders. They could be an army. Under his leadership, the club began to expand chapter by chapter along the eastern seaboard. What had begun as a small Maryland outfit was suddenly spreading like wildfire into Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Delaware, and beyond. The way they grew was simple: intimidation and recruitment. Ride into a town, make themselves known, and either local riders patched over, or they were crushed. It was a strategy that worked because the Pagans weren't afraid of confrontation. If someone resisted, fists flew, knives came out, and sometimes worse. Word spread quickly. When the Pagans came, you either joined them or you kept your head down. The early Pagans became infamous for their look as much as their actions. They weren't polished or polished rebels like Hollywood bikers. They were rough, dirty, and intimidating. Their patch, a menacing depiction of the Norse fire god Surtur, became a warning sign to anyone who saw it. While most motorcycle clubs still carried a hint of camaraderie and fun, the Pagans projected menace. Even in their earliest days, walking into a bar with pagan jackets on meant something. Trouble was near. But it wasn't just about intimidation. The Pagans began to build a culture around themselves. Loyalty was absolute. Betrayal was unthinkable. Violence wasn't just expected, it was celebrated. Every beating handed out to rivals, every bar brawl, every intimidation tactic reinforced their reputation. They weren't the biggest motorcycle club in America, but in their region, they were quickly becoming the most feared. By the early 1970s, the Pagans had already separated themselves from the average motorcycle crowd. They didn't want to be weekend warriors, they wanted power. They wanted to dominate territory, control money, and strike fear into anyone who dared oppose them. Small-time hustling became organized racketeering. Drug deals that started out casual became pipelines. And through it all, the club grew tighter, more structured, and more ruthless. The East Coast wasn't ready for them. In a region filled with powerful mobs, dangerous street gangs, and entrenched crime families, the Pagans stood out for one reason. They didn't back down. They didn't care if their rivals were armed. They didn't care if the police were watching. They didn't care if civilians got caught in the middle. Every fight was taken to the extreme, and every confrontation became a chance to prove that the Pagans were not just another motorcycle club. They were a force of nature. In the beginning, the Pagans were underestimated. Other clubs saw them as upstarts, rough riders who weren't in the same league as the Angels, outlaws, or bandidos. But what everyone soon learned was that the Pagans weren't trying to imitate anyone. They were carving out their own legacy of terror. From backroad rides to brutal street wars, their rise was just beginning. What made the Pagans' birth so dangerous was that it wasn't about fun or freedom anymore. It was about survival and power. Every new member meant another soldier. Every new chapter meant more territory, and every act of violence meant another message sent to the underworld. The Pagans were here, and they weren't leaving. Early violence. The Pagans were born in rebellion, but it was their early violence that carved their identity in blood. While other motorcycle clubs of the era might have fought among themselves in parking lots or bars, the Pagans turned brutality into a calling card. By the late 1960s and early 1970s, anyone in Maryland, Pennsylvania, or New Jersey who saw a jacket bearing the fire god Surtur knew that trouble was close behind. In their early years, fights were spontaneous, but never small. A night of drinking could quickly turn into a scene of chaos when the Pagans decided someone looked at them the wrong way or disrespected their colors. They swung fists until bones snapped, then followed up with boots, knives, or chains. What separated them from other clubs wasn't just their willingness to fight. It was how far they were willing to go. Bar fights didn't end when one side gave up. They ended when someone was unconscious, bleeding, or worse. This earned the Pagans a reputation with police departments up and down the East Coast. Officers learned quickly that responding to a call involving the Pagans meant walking into carnage. Broken glass, overturned tables, and victims left behind to crawl to the hospital. Arrests became routine, but convictions were rare. Witnesses feared retaliation, and victims often chose to keep their mouths shut rather than risk another beating. Violence became so central to pagan culture that it wasn't just tolerated, it was expected. New members weren't fully trusted until they proved themselves in a fight. Earning a patch wasn't just about riding or brotherhood, it was about showing that you could swing hard, take a beating, and come back for more. Prospects were thrown into fights deliberately, tested to see if they would hold the line when the fists and blades came out. Those who failed quietly disappeared. Those who succeeded carried the scars as proof they belonged. But these weren't just random fights. The Pagans began using violence strategically. They shook down bar owners, strip clubs, and small businesses, forcing them to pay for protection. Those who refused quickly learned what protection really meant. A broken jaw, a smashed-up storefront, tires slashed and windows shattered until compliance came naturally. The Pagans didn't need lawyers or contracts. Their power came from fear, and fear was enforced with blood. The early 1970s brought the first real confrontations with rival motorcycle clubs. On the East Coast, smaller independent clubs tried to hold their ground. It rarely worked. If another patch showed up in a bar the Pagans considered theirs, a fight was guaranteed. By the end of the night, that rival either joined the Pagans, fled the city, or was carried out on a stretcher. One story still whispered among old investigators involved a pagan walking into a bar where a rival biker was drinking alone. Instead of words, the pagan smashed a beer bottle across his face, dragged him outside, and beat him until his own brothers pulled him away. The rival survived but never returned to that town. For the Pagans, this wasn't excessive, it was policy. Their colors had to mean fear, and every act of violence reinforced it. The brutality didn't stop with outsiders. The Pagans also kept their own members in line with fists and steel. Anyone who broke the code, whether by skimming money, showing disrespect, or acting weak, was punished in ways that left permanent reminders. Members were beaten by their own brothers, while the rest watched, learning what disobedience cost. In some cases, the punishment went further. A brother who betrayed the club might vanish altogether, his fate left to rumor and silence. What made the Pagans' violence so effective was how unpredictable it was. They weren't bound by restraint or rules of engagement. If someone crossed them, the response could be immediate and overwhelming. A simple insult could end with hospital beds. A rival making the wrong move could find his bike in flames the next morning. Their enemies never knew when or how the Pagans would strike, only that they would. This atmosphere of constant aggression made law enforcement nervous. Police departments began labeling the Pagans as a rising outlaw threat, warning that their appetite for violence rivaled anything seen on the East Coast before. Reports circulated that the club's numbers were growing, their fights were getting bloodier, and their disregard for authority made them nearly impossible to control. The violence also brought unwanted attention from the public. Newspaper headlines began to describe biker riots and gang wars, with the pagans often at the center. Ordinary citizens grew terrified of sharing space with them. A family out for dinner might leave a restaurant if a dozen pagans walked in. Women clutched their purses tighter on sidewalks, and bartenders braced for chaos as soon as the patches appeared. Fear spread faster than the actual bloodshed, but that was exactly how the pagans wanted it. The more violent they became, the more powerful their reputation grew. They weren't the biggest club yet, but they didn't have to be. Their fists and knives spoke louder than numbers ever could. By the time the 1970s reached their peak, the pagans had already carved a name for themselves as a gang you didn't challenge. Their rise had begun not with diplomacy or alliances, but with the raw, brutal language of violence. Expansion on the East Coast. The pagans had proven themselves through violence. By the early 1970s, their name carried weight in bars, neighborhoods, and criminal circles from Maryland to Pennsylvania. But the true rise of the pagans wasn't just about throwing fists in local taverns. It was about expansion. A gang that stayed small would eventually be swallowed by larger forces. The Hells Angels were pushing eastward, the Outlaws had roots in the Midwest, and smaller clubs dotted the map. If the pagans wanted survival, they needed to grow. And they chose to grow the only way they knew how: through force, intimidation, and calculated takeover. At first, expansion meant moving into nearby cities. Maryland was their home, but soon Philadelphia, Pittsburgh, and Atlantic City became pagan strongholds. Each move followed the same pattern. A handful of members would roll into town, stake a claim, and make their presence impossible to ignore. If a rival club existed, the pagans confronted them directly. Sometimes the rivals patched over, abandoning their old colors for the pagan patch. Sometimes they fought, and when they did, the pagans fought dirtier, harder, and longer. By the end, the outcome was the same. The fire god Surtur spread his shadow over new ground. But the pagans weren't just after territory for the sake of pride. Expansion brought money. Each new city meant more bars to tax, more clubs to control, and more businesses to squeeze. Every new chapter meant another network for moving drugs, weapons, and stolen goods. The pagans quickly realized that dominance on the East Coast could mean riches beyond anything they'd imagined when they were just a group of riders drinking beers in Maryland. What made the expansion terrifying was the discipline behind it. These weren't random riders starting chapters wherever they wanted. Expansion was strategic. Pagan leaders chose locations with care. They wanted access to ports, highways, and urban centers where money and crime flowed. Atlantic City wasn't chosen for its boardwalk, it was chosen because gambling, nightlife, and vice meant endless opportunity. Philadelphia wasn't about cheesesteaks, it was about docks, unions, and access to organized crime families who could move drugs by the ton. With expansion came structure. The pagans began to organize themselves less like a brotherhood of riders and more like a corporation of criminals. Chapters answered to regional leaders. Orders came down from the top. Disputes were settled by violence, but also by internal codes that reinforced hierarchy. For the first time, the pagans weren't just feared brawlers. They were a machine. This new discipline made them even more dangerous. Rival clubs could fight them, but they couldn't match their organization. Street gangs could challenge them, but they didn't have the network. Even police struggled because the pagans weren't just causing random chaos anymore. They were building an empire, and every act of violence had purpose behind it. The expansion wasn't without bloodshed. In many places, smaller independent clubs tried to hold their ground. They learned quickly what resistance meant. Some chapters were absorbed by the pagans after bloody confrontations. Others were wiped out completely, their members driven into hiding or left beaten in the streets. To outsiders, it looked like chaos, but inside the pagan ranks, it was calculated conquest. By the mid-1970s, the pagans had chapters in multiple states, stretching across the eastern seaboard. Their numbers grew into the hundreds, and with each new member came new muscle. It wasn't just the number of bikers that terrified their rivals, it was the quality of their soldiers. Every pagan had been tested, every pagan had proven loyalty through violence, and every pagan knew that failure to act meant punishment worse than death. Expansion also brought them into closer contact with organized crime. In Philadelphia, Pittsburgh, and Atlantic City, the pagans rubbed shoulders with the Italian mafia, Irish street gangs, and various underworld figures. Deals were struck, alliances formed. At times, the pagans worked for mob bosses, providing muscle or handling dirty jobs. At other times, they forced the mob to recognize them as equals. demanding their share of the profits flowing through the city. Either way, their reach only grew stronger. Law enforcement watched this expansion with alarm. Reports described the pagans as spreading like wildfire, consuming territories one by one. Local police forces were often overwhelmed, rolling into town and making themselves at home. Even when arrests were made, intimidation kept juries silent and witnesses away. The pagans weren't just fighting rivals, they were undermining the very systems meant to stop them. Perhaps the most unsettling part of the pagan expansion was the culture they carried with them. Each new chapter brought the same code: absolute loyalty, absolute violence, and absolute fear. From Baltimore to Atlantic City, from Pittsburgh to Philadelphia, stories circulated of pagan brutality. Men beaten with chains, bars burned down, entire neighborhoods forced to live under their shadow. The consistency of this fear showed just how deeply the pagans had embedded their identity in the East Coast underworld. By the late 1970s, it was undeniable. The pagans were no longer a regional nuisance. They were a power. Their expansion had made them one of the most dominant outlaw motorcycle clubs on the East Coast, rivaling the outlaws in the Midwest and preparing them for inevitable clashes with the Hells Angels. Their rise wasn't just about numbers. It was about a reputation for violence that grew with every new chapter, a reputation that turned their expansion into legend. First blood with the Hells Angels. For years, the pagans spread across the East Coast with fists, blades, and fire, but as much as they terrified local gangs and dominated small towns, one name loomed larger than them all: the Hells Angels. By the 1970s, the Angels had already become a global force. Their red and white patches were feared on the West Coast, in Europe, and even in movies and newspapers. If the pagans wanted to rule the East Coast, they knew a collision with the Hells Angels wasn't just possible, it was inevitable. The rivalry didn't begin with a declaration of war. It began with chance encounters, patches crossing in bars, and tension that could be cut with a knife. When an angel and a pagan walked into the same room, everyone else knew to clear out. Fists would fly, bottles would smash, and the aftermath was often a bloodied floor and silent witnesses. The first encounters were small skirmishes, but they lit the fuse for a conflict that would spiral into one of the most violent biker rivalries in American history. The pagans saw the Angels as arrogant invaders, bikers from the West who believed their reputation alone made them kings. The Angels saw the pagans as dirty, unpolished upstarts, wild dogs playing at being wolves. Both sides had egos too large, tempers too short, and too much pride to back down. The result was blood. One of the earliest flashpoints came in New Jersey. The pagans had long considered the state their home turf, a critical bridge between Philadelphia, Atlantic City, and New York. When the Angels tried to plant a foothold there, the pagans responded with unrelenting violence. Bars that dared to serve Angels found themselves vandalized. Angel bikes were set on fire in parking lots. Members were ambushed, beaten, and in some cases left for dead. For the pagans, New Jersey wasn't negotiable. It was their territory, and no one, not even the Hells Angels, would take it. The Angels, of course, didn't back down. Retaliations came quick and vicious. Pagan hangouts were firebombed. Members caught alone were beaten with chains and bats. Even public spaces weren't safe. One brawl in the late 1970s at a Newark bar turned into a full-on riot with knives flashing, fists pounding, and bodies collapsing. Police swarmed the scene, but by the time they restored order, dozens were injured and both sides had sent a message. This wasn't a rivalry anymore, it was war. The escalation only continued through the 1980s. Pagan leaders began to see the Angels not just as rivals, but as existential threats. If the Angels secured New Jersey or New York, they could strangle the Pagans' expansion and control the entire East Coast. To stop this, the Pagans unleashed their most violent enforcers, men whose only job was to hurt and kill in the name of the patch. Pagan squads began hunting Angels with military-like precision, tracking their movements, targeting their businesses, and waiting for moments when they were most vulnerable. The violence became so intense that law enforcement agencies from multiple states began issuing joint reports warning of a full-scale biker war. FBI files described both clubs as paramilitary organizations operating with extreme violence and zero regard for civilian life. Investigators feared that the battles could spill into city streets, threatening not just bikers, but anyone unlucky enough to be nearby. And they were right. Innocent bystanders were injured, some killed, as bombs exploded and bullets flew in densely populated neighborhoods. What made the rivalry particularly terrifying was how public it became. The Angels, used to media coverage, often flaunted their battles. The Pagans, however, embraced something darker: quiet, surgical brutality. While the angels made headlines, the pagans made bodies disappear. One former investigator later remarked that what set the pagans apart was their unpredictability. With the angels, you expected chaos. With the pagans, you didn't know if it was coming at all, until you were already bleeding. By the late 1980s, both sides had dug in. The angels had stronger numbers worldwide, but the pagans had home advantage on the East Coast and a willingness to outmatch violence with savagery. Their clashes weren't just brawls anymore, they were wars for survival. Every bar fight, every ambush, every bombing was part of a larger chess game played in blood. Inside the pagan code, the pagans grew through violence and carved their place on the East Coast with fire and steel. But what kept the gang together through all that blood wasn't just fear from outsiders. It was a code, a set of unspoken and spoken rules that made the pagans more than just a gang of bikers. It turned them into a brotherhood, bound by loyalty, discipline, and the constant threat of punishment. At the heart of the pagan code was absolute loyalty. Once you wore the patch, you weren't just part of a club, you were property of it. Every action, every decision, every move you made reflected on the pagans as a whole. Betrayal wasn't tolerated, hesitation wasn't excused, and weakness was considered as dangerous as treason. Members were expected to put the club above family, above friends, and above everything else in their lives. A wife or child might plead for a man to leave, but the patch came first, and anyone who questioned that soon learned why no one left the pagans without consequences. Violence wasn't only a weapon against outsiders, it was a tool for discipline inside the club. If a member disrespected leadership, disobeyed an order, or even embarrassed the club in public, he would be punished. Punishment often came in the form of beatings carried out by his own brothers. These weren't symbolic slaps on the wrist, they were brutal assaults that left bones broken and skin torn. Sometimes they were public, carried out in front of other members as a warning. Other times they were private, meant to send a message that the club always had eyes and the code was always enforced. Another pillar of the pagan code was silence. No one talked to the police. Ever. To even be suspected of talking could mean a death sentence. The pagans prided themselves on being airtight, harder to infiltrate than most gangs, and much of that came from this culture of fear. Members knew that the slightest whisper to law enforcement would be met with retribution, not just for themselves, but sometimes for their families too. It was this vow of silence that allowed the pagans to grow into a criminal empire without constant collapse from informants. The code also dictated how members lived their daily lives. There were strict rules about who could wear the pagan patch and how. Members were forbidden from letting anyone touch their colors, even wives or girlfriends. To disrespect the patch was to disrespect the entire brotherhood. The same applied to territory. Pagans defended their bars, their neighborhoods, and their chapters with religious devotion. Even the smallest slight, like a rival biker hanging out in a pagan bar, was treated as a violation of sacred law. The chain of command was another unshakable part of the code. Every chapter had a president, vice president, and enforcers. Orders moved down, not up. The man at the top gave direction, and those below carried it out without question. Disobedience wasn't just frowned upon, it was dangerous. A pagan who ignored orders risked not just punishment, but elimination. In a world where weakness could get the whole gang killed, the code demanded obedience without hesitation. But perhaps the most frightening part of the pagan code was how it glorified violence as honor. Members weren't only expected to fight, they were expected to enjoy it. Bloodshed became proof of loyalty. A man who could throw punches, stab rivals, or pull a trigger without blinking wasn't just a good pagan, he was a great one. Stories of members' violence became legends, retold at gatherings to inspire fear and admiration. In this way, the code fed itself, each act of brutality cementing the culture that made the pagans so feared. The rituals reinforced the code further. Prospects, the men trying to earn a patch, were subjected to humiliation, dangerous tasks, and brutal tests to prove their worth. They might be ordered to fight multiple men at once, or commit crimes that could send them to prison, all just to prove their loyalty. Once they passed, the initiation into full membership was both a reward and a curse. They were celebrated for joining the Brotherhood, but they also crossed a line they could never return from. Even money was tied to the code. Members were expected to contribute to the club, whether through dues, cuts from criminal earnings, or simply providing for brothers in need. To refuse was to break the code. And when debts weren't paid, the enforcers stepped in, ensuring no one forgot that the pagans owned every part of their lives. Law enforcement often described the pagan code as a mixture of military structure and cult-like devotion. It made the club nearly impossible to infiltrate because members truly believed in the sanctity of their brotherhood. and those who doubted, they were removed in the most permanent ways possible. Deals with the mob. By the time the pagans had carved their name in blood across the East Coast, one truth had become clear: violence could win them territory, but it couldn't win them empires. To control entire cities, to move drugs by the ton, to launder money without collapsing under police pressure, they needed partners who already had those systems in place. And on the East Coast, no one had deeper roots in crime than the mob. The Italian mafia had been running rackets for decades, their influence stretching from the docks of New York to the gambling dens of Atlantic City. They controlled unions, ports, politicians, and pipelines of drugs flowing in from overseas. For the pagans, forging ties with these families wasn't just a smart move, it was survival. They needed the mob's connections, and the mob needed the pagans' muscle. The alliance started small. Pagans worked as hired enforcers for mob bosses who wanted debts collected or rivals silenced. If a loan shark needed someone roughed up, pagans handled it. If a witness needed to be scared out of testifying, pagans did the job. The mob liked them because they were reliable. The pagans didn't hesitate, didn't ask questions, and didn't leave loose ends. What started as contract work soon grew into something bigger. Drugs were the bridge that cemented the relationship. The mob had the international pipelines, shipments of heroin, cocaine, and meth flowing in through East Coast ports. The pagans had the street soldiers. Together they built a distribution network that funneled drugs from shipping containers into neighborhoods across Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Maryland, and beyond. Every sale put money into both pockets. Every deal deepened the bond between bikers and mobsters. But alliances with the mob were never safe. They came with rules, with expectations, and with punishments for failure. Pagan leaders quickly learned that mob bosses weren't to be crossed. Missed payments or sloppy mistakes could mean more than just a warning. Entire chapters risked being cut off, or worse. Yet the pagans thrived under this pressure. Their violent culture made them perfectly suited to the mob's demands. If someone stepped out of line, the pagans didn't just fix the problem, they eliminated it. This partnership also gave the pagans legitimacy in the criminal underworld. Small-time gangs suddenly had to treat them with respect, not just because of their fists, but because of who stood behind them. A pagan wasn't just a biker anymore, he was a soldier tied to powerful mafia families. Bars and clubs that resisted paying protection to the pagans quickly found themselves pressured by mob associates too. It was a 1-2 punch few dared to challenge. Of course, the relationship wasn't without friction. The mob valued discipline, order, and predictability. The pagans thrived on chaos, fear, and blood. There were times when the bikers' unpredictability caused headaches for mob bosses, especially when public violence drew police attention, but the money was too good, and the pagans too useful for the alliance to break. Whenever tensions rose, leaders on both sides smoothed things over, often with more cash and more promises of loyalty. By the late 1970s and early 1980s, the pagans were heavily intertwined with organized crime. They weren't just muscle anymore, they were partners in rackets that stretched across entire states, from meth labs in rural Pennsylvania to heroin shipments hitting New York. Pagan fingerprints were everywhere. Their members were seen in mob-controlled casinos, strip clubs, and trucking companies, blurring the line between biker gang and mafia family. Law enforcement struggled to untangle the web. Investigators who tracked the pagans often found themselves running into mob operations, and vice versa. One FBI agent later remarked that trying to hit the pagans without hitting the mob was like trying to pull one snake out of a pit without touching the others. The two groups had become so intertwined that targeting one meant provoking both. The deals with the mob also escalated the pagans' internal culture. With more money flowing in, the stakes grew higher. Disputes over drug profits or territory weren't just internal matters anymore. They were tied to mafia contracts. A pagan who stole from the club wasn't just betraying his brothers, he was endangering the entire network. That kind of betrayal wasn't forgiven. It was punished with brutality so severe it made headlines, reinforcing the pagans' image as one of the most dangerous outlaw biker gangs in America. Drugs and dominance. For all the violence, all the backroom deals, and all the alliances with the mob, nothing fueled the rise of the pagans quite like drugs. It was narcotics that turned the club from a feared biker gang into a criminal empire. And it was the drug trade that made them millionaires while burying countless bodies along the way. The early days were small time. Bags of marijuana here, a few pills there, the kind of street-level hustle that paid for beer and bikes but didn't build empires. That changed when the pagans discovered methamphetamine. Cheap to make, easy to move, and wildly addictive, meth became their golden ticket. Unlike heroin or cocaine, which required international pipelines and connections, meth could be cooked right at home in rural basements, backwoods barns, and makeshift labs. And once it hit the streets, demand never stopped. The pagans didn't just sell meth, they industrialized it. Entire chapters were tasked with running cook sites, securing chemicals, and protecting distribution networks. These weren't small batches. They were large-scale operations producing pounds at a time, enough to flood entire cities. From Philadelphia to Pittsburgh, from Baltimore to Atlantic City, meth with pagan fingerprints on it was everywhere. But meth was only the beginning. As their network expanded, the pagans became middlemen for heroin and cocaine too, thanks to their alliances with organized crime. They didn't always handle the international shipments, but once the drugs hit the ports, the pagans became the enforcers and distributors. Street gangs bought from them, dealers paid them. Every transaction put money into pagan pockets, and every dollar reinforced their dominance. The profits transformed the club. What had once been a ragtag group of riders was now flush with cash. Members drove luxury cars, carried stacks of bills, and flaunted jewelry alongside their biker cuts. Clubhouses became fortresses of crime, filled with drugs, weapons, and cash. Bars and strip clubs run by pagans turned into hubs for distribution, where deals were cut under neon lights and backed by muscle waiting in the shadows, but the drug money came with blood. Anyone who crossed the pagans in business quickly learned what happened to traitors. Dealers who failed to pay were beaten, maimed, or killed. Rival gangs who tried to cut into their profits were hunted down. Even family members weren't safe if they got in the way. Stories spread of pagans torching houses, ambushing rivals, and leaving bodies in alleys as warnings. The drug trade didn't just make them rich, it made them feared in ways no bar fight ever could. Law enforcement soon recognized the scale of the problem. Local police couldn't keep up with the sheer size of pagan distribution. State and federal agencies began targeting them, launching joint operations that stretched for years. Undercover agents infiltrated drug pipelines, wiretaps tracked shipments, and indictments piled up. But for every raid, every bust, another pagan lab popped up somewhere else. The demand was too high, the profits too rich, and the brotherhood too loyal to stop. Inside the club, drugs became more than business, they became culture. Many pagans used the same drugs they sold, particularly meth and cocaine, feeding addictions that drove their violence even higher. Fights became more savage, paranoia spread, and the gang's unpredictability reached terrifying levels. A pagan high on meth wasn't just dangerous, he was uncontrollable, capable of violence even his own brothers feared. The dominance wasn't just about drugs on the street, it was about control. In some towns, the pagans didn't just sell drugs, they controlled entire markets. Local dealers had no choice but to buy from them. Independent cooks or smugglers were forced out or eliminated. Entire neighborhoods came under pagan shadow, where every dollar spent on drugs found its way back to the fire god patch. And through it all, the pagan leadership reaped the rewards. Millions in cash flowed upward, enriching presidents, vice presidents, and national officers who lived lives far beyond what most outlaws could dream of. With wealth came influence, with influence came more soldiers, and with more soldiers came deeper control of the East Coast drug trade. The pagans had always thrived on violence, but with drugs, they learned something even more dangerous: how to turn that violence into an empire. The fists, knives, and guns that once built their reputation now protected a business worth millions. And as long as the demand for meth, heroin, and cocaine never slowed, the pagans knew their dominance would only grow. Law enforcement in the crosshairs. For most outlaw motorcycle clubs, clashes with the police are inevitable, but for the pagans, it went far beyond arrests and raids. They didn't just resist law enforcement, they declared war on it. From the late 1970s onward, as the pagans grew into a drug-fueled empire, police became more than a nuisance. They were obstacles, threats to profit, and, most dangerously, targets. Members of the club didn't simply fear cops, they plotted against them, and in some cases, they made examples out of them. Stories from the East Coast tell of patrol cars ambushed, officers stalked after hours, and investigators warned with firebombs hurled through their windows. In New Jersey, a detective working a pagan case came out one morning to find his personal car torched, the hood spray-painted with the fire god symbol. In Baltimore, a local cop was beaten so severely outside a pagan-run bar that he was left unconscious in the street, with a note pinned to his uniform, "Stay out of our business." The tactics were meant to instill fear, and often they worked. Local police forces, underfunded and outnumbered, found themselves reluctant to patrol neighborhoods dominated by the pagans. Routine stops became high-risk encounters, and any officer who dared to investigate too aggressively risked becoming a target. But it wasn't just small-town cops. Federal investigators, prosecutors, even judges felt the pressure. Cases against pagans were complicated by witness intimidation, mysterious disappearances of evidence, and juries too scared to convict. On one occasion, a prosecutor received a package on his desk containing a dead rat and a single bullet. The message was unmistakable: convict the pagan on trial, and you're next. At the street level, the violence escalated. Raids on pagan clubhouses were met with open hostility. Bottles thrown, shots fired, dogs set loose. Cops raiding meth labs often found themselves walking into traps, booby-trapped doors, hidden explosives, or guard posts manned by armed brothers ready to shoot. It wasn't just organized crime, it was insurgency. Perhaps most chilling were the reports of cops being followed home. Wives noticed motorcycles trailing them on their drive, children spotted unfamiliar men outside their schools. It created an atmosphere where law enforcement officers had to look over their shoulders every day, knowing the pagans were watching. For a gang that thrived on fear, this was as much a weapon as any knife or gun. Law enforcement responded with force of its own. By the 1990s, federal task forces were assembled, combining the FBI, ATF, and DEA to dismantle the pagan network. But even these elite squads struggled. Every time they made an arrest, another pagan seemed to step up. Informants planted inside the club disappeared, some never to be seen again. Those who survived lived the rest of their lives under protection, haunted by the threat of revenge. One veteran ATF agent described the pagans as a shadow army. Unlike traditional organized crime families that operated behind closed doors, the pagans were loud, aggressive, and willing to put their violence on full display. They wanted cops to know they weren't afraid, that they would meet force with force. In their world, the badge didn't carry authority, it painted a target. Courtrooms became battlefields too. Pagan members on trial often filled the gallery with brothers in full colors, their presence a silent warning to jurors and witnesses alike. Judges, prosecutors, and defense attorneys alike spoke of the intimidation that hung over the room like smoke. And when convictions were secured, prisons didn't guarantee safety. Many correctional officers were assaulted or threatened by pagan inmates who carried the war behind bars. What made the conflict even more dangerous was the corruption that crept in. In some towns, officers looked the other way. Payoffs ensured that bars and clubhouses stayed open, raids were tipped off, and investigations were quietly buried. For every honest cop trying to take the pagans down, another had been bought off or scared silent. This dual reality made the gang feel untouchable. The pagans weren't content to simply evade the law. They wanted to dominate it, to make the system itself bend under their presence. Every firebombed cruiser, every intimidated jury, every silenced witness was a message. The pagans answer to no one. And yet, even in the face of relentless investigations and high-profile trials, their aggression against law enforcement never fully stopped. For them, it wasn't just about profit. It was about identity. To be a pagan was to be an outlaw in the truest sense, someone who didn't just live outside the law, but stood against it, knife in hand, daring anyone to cross their line. The modern pagans. The story of the pagans isn't frozen in the past. They didn't fade like so many outlaw clubs that burned bright and then collapsed under their own violence. No, the pagans are still here, bigger, bolder, and more dangerous than ever. Today, the club claims thousands of members spread across multiple states, with strongholds in New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Maryland, Virginia, and New York. Their colors still carry the same fear they did decades ago, and their reputation as one of the big four outlaw motorcycle gangs remains firmly intact. But unlike the romanticized biker image you see in movies, the modern pagans are less about open-road brotherhood and more about organized systemic crime. At the center of their current power is Keith Conan Richter, the national president whose name alone makes law enforcement uneasy. Richter isn't just a symbol of loyalty, he's proof that the pagans still live and breathe violence. Under his watch, the gang has grown aggressively, expanding into new states while reinforcing control over old ones. Law enforcement reports describe them as disciplined, ruthless, and increasingly militarized. No longer a scattered gang of bikers, but a coordinated army of criminals. The money still comes from the same sources: drugs, extortion, and violence. Methamphetamine remains their crown jewel, but cocaine, heroin, and fentanyl have also entered their pipelines. The modern pagans control street-level distribution networks that stretch from rural towns to urban centers. Local dealers either buy from them or disappear. Rival gangs risk bloodshed if they try to move in. And with their long-standing ties to organized crime, the pagans have the logistics to move product at a scale most gangs can only dream of. But the modern pagans don't just stop at drugs. They've embedded themselves in extortion rackets, strip clubs, and loan sharking operations. Their reputation alone often secures their profits. Business owners know what happens when they say no, and many pay without protest. Others who resist often wake up to vandalized shops, firebombed cars, or beatings in the middle of the street. Fear is as much a currency as money itself. What makes the modern pagans especially dangerous is their willingness to target law enforcement and rivals alike in full view of the public. In 2019, a massive brawl broke out at a New Jersey bar, leaving multiple people hospitalized and sending shockwaves through the biker world. Witnesses described a scene of chaos: chairs flying, knives flashing, and bikers in full pagan colors unleashing violence like it was routine. For the pagans, it wasn't just a fight, it was a statement. We are still the kings of the East Coast. Federal prosecutors have also highlighted the gang's use of military-style weapons and tactics. During raids, police have seized explosives, assault rifles, and stockpiles of ammunition. Some pagans wear bulletproof vests, carry radios, and coordinate like soldiers on a battlefield. This isn't just street violence anymore, it's organized warfare. And it's aimed at anyone who dares to challenge them. The FBI, ATF, and DEA continue to launch investigations, but dismantling the pagans has proven nearly impossible. Their strict code of silence remains intact. Members rarely talk, and those who even appear to waver risk swift punishment. Informants are almost always exposed, and the consequences are deadly. Trials drag on for years, but convictions never seem to slow the machine. For every member put behind bars, another steps up, ready to bleed for the patch. The modern pagans also remain deeply feared inside prison walls. Their reputation ensures protection and influence behind bars, where they recruit, intimidate, and maintain ties to the outside world. Even incarcerated, their leaders pull strings, sending orders that ripple across states. The club doesn't stop at the prison gate, it thrives within it. For communities along the East Coast, the pagans are more than just a shadow, they're a presence. Their bikes roar through towns, their patches appear in bars, and their violence leaves marks that never fully fade. Parents warn their kids, businesses pay their dues, and rivals think twice before crossing them. And yet, despite decades of indictments, raids, and headlines, the pagans endure. They've survived betrayals, massacres, and endless battles with both rivals and law enforcement. Their rise wasn't just about violence, it was about adaptability. When one leader fell, another rose. When one racket collapsed, another opened. They've shifted, evolved, and endured, always finding new ways to thrive in the shadows. Because if the past has shown us anything, it's this: when the pagans rise, they don't stop. And for the enemies who stand in their way, the cost is always the same: blood on the pavement and silence in their wake. Betrayals from within. For decades, the pagans' greatest strength has been their code, loyalty above all else. But like any criminal empire, their greatest threat has often come not from outside enemies, but from within. The pagans built themselves into a fortress of silence, teaching every member that the club came before family, freedom, and even life itself. Yet time and again, cracks have appeared in that wall. And when they did, the fallout was devastating. The first cracks came in the form of small betrayals. Members skimming cash from drug deals, hiding profits from leadership, or cutting secret side deals with rival gangs. These weren't minor offenses. To the pagans, theft wasn't about money, it was about honor. A man who stole from his brothers wasn't just a thief, he was a traitor. And traitors didn't walk away. Stories spread of pagans who vanished overnight, only to be found days later, beaten beyond recognition or dumped in shallow graves. But the real betrayals were far worse. Law enforcement agencies, desperate to take down the gang, sought to turn members into informants. For years it seemed impossible. The code of silence was too strong, the fear of retribution too heavy. Yet eventually men cracked. Facing life sentences, some decided prison wasn't worth their loyalty. They talked, they named names. And when they did, the entire club shook. The most damaging betrayals came in the 2000s, when undercover operations exposed members at the highest levels. FBI stings revealed not only drug trafficking and weapons charges, but also connections between national officers and organized crime families. Indictments swept up dozens of members at once, and much of it was fueled by men who once swore the pagan oath. The fallout was catastrophic. Raids on clubhouses, seizures of drugs and cash, and public trials that dragged the pagan name into the spotlight. Inside the club, the paranoia grew. Brothers began to wonder who they could trust. Meetings became tense, members accused one another, and punishments grew harsher. In some chapters, mere suspicion was enough to get a man beaten or expelled. Leaders knew that the greatest danger to the pagans wasn't always a rival biker or a federal agent. It was the man sitting beside them at the clubhouse table. One betrayal in particular sent shockwaves through the gang. A respected member, facing decades in prison, agreed to testify in exchange for a lighter sentence. His testimony directly implicated leaders in multiple murders, drug shipments, and racketeering schemes. For the pagans, it was a nightmare, proof that their code could be broken, that loyalty had limits. The club moved quickly to erase his name from their ranks, but the damage was done. Entire networks collapsed, and dozens of brothers went to prison because one man chose survival over silence. These betrayals left scars deeper than any war with the Hells Angels or the Outlaws. Rivals could be fought, cops could be killed, but betrayal from within poisoned the very heart of the brotherhood. The pagans responded with even more brutality, enforcing loyalty with fear. Members suspected of weakness were tested, pushed to commit acts of violence that tied them to the club forever. Once blood was on your hands, leaving was no longer an option. Yet the betrayals never stopped completely. As long as prison sentences loomed and federal agents dangled deals, some pagans chose to flip. And each time they did, the gang had to tighten its ranks, rebuild, and remind the world why betraying the pagans was one of the deadliest decisions a man could ever make. The modern pagans live with this constant tension. They are stronger than ever, feared across the East Coast, but they know their empire can't be destroyed from the outside. If they ever fall, it will come from within. Brothers turning on brothers, and loyalty breaking under the weight of fear. That is the dark irony of the pagans' rise. The same violence that keeps them powerful is the same violence that drives men to betray them. And in the outlaw world, betrayal is never forgiven. It's only repaid in blood.